Hi, welcome to Brookings and to Opportunity 08 and to December. We are 1 month away from Iowa. The sprint, the marathon has descended into sprint, and given the weather that just passed through Iowa and New Hampshire, which was ice followed by rain, it's going to be a slick and slippery and even muddy sprint in more ways than one, and we're all looking forward to it here as we've been following this election cycle and the issues in it for almost an entire year. Opportunity 08 is a project of the Brookings Institution with a number of our partners from around the country and friends. We commissioned about 25 papers a year ago on the top issues facing the country and the presidential candidate, the candidates for the presidency. And there is a book that is a compilation of some of the greatest hits of the project that is available here at the Brookings Press bookstore right outside this auditorium. And you can find us at opportunity08.com, opportunity08.org, or brookings.edu. As the campaign winds up to its sprint this next month, we're going to be hearing a lot from the candidates about a lot of different things. Judging by the recent debates and TV ads, we can expect the candidates to taunt each other about a range of issues from Iraq to health care to immigration to religious belief to guns, not to mention hairdos, TV shows, UFOs, and baseball allegiances. But as the candidates taunt, groups of voters will still be looking for very straightforward answers to core questions that have always been central to American political campaigns. One in particular is going to be the focus of today's discussion. How will the next president deal with mainstream economic issues? Every candidate in the presidential race claims to be fighting for the middle class in particular, which is both good policy and good politics. Of course, there is a long tradition in America to define the middle class broadly, and I'm going to take two recurring minimum issues in American politics to give you a sense of that. On the one hand, Americans who earn the minimum wage tend to think of themselves as either in the middle class or trying to get there. Yet at a 40-hour week and 52 weeks in a year, that would net somebody just over $12,000. The other minimum issue out there is the alternative minimum tax, which the Congress needs to fix because people, roughly 15% of people earning $75,000 to $100,000 a year are caught into this tax that was designed to catch the super rich from avoiding taxes. Yet many of those people feel that they're in the middle class. So from taxes to housing markets to education, all of those issues intersect across the two that I raised. The role of the government in helping the middle class is going to be a big issue in the campaign. Today we've pulled together two panels to discuss this. The first one, the one that you see here, is a panel of Brookings experts on the issues. And then we'll be followed by a panel representing three of the leading campaigns that will be moderated by Rick Klein, our colleague from ABC News. I should say Opportunity 08 is a partnership between Brookings and ABC News, and through all of our discussions, we've worked with ABC to moderate them and to use their website and their TV offerings to help promote the project, and we've been really appreciative of their partnership. So today, we have a very distinguished panel here from Brookings, including two vice presidents and one of our leading scholars. I'll start with Ron Haskins, who's a senior fellow in economic studies, whose work on work and poverty and middle class issues has been a mainstay at Brookings in economic studies and also in the Center on Children and Families, where he's a co-director. Bill Gale, who's the vice president for economic studies here at Brookings and also co-directs the Tax Policy Center, a partnership between Brookings and the Urban Institute, and also co-directs or directs the Retirement Security Project. And Bruce Katz, who is the vice president and director of the Metropolitan Policy Program here at Brookings. And I figured I'd start with this issue of the middle class with all three and just ask each of them in turn quickly. There's so many issues in the middle class. It's defined broadly. Work connects to the middle class, education, housing, transportation. What is or should be the main issue that the candidates should focus on, and what should they do about it? Start with Ron.
They should make more people and help more people enter the middle class. Whether they can do that's another issue, but that is the big issue in our economy. I think everyone agrees the more people we have in the middle class, the better off we'll all be. The American economy has been brilliant, as our recent project on mobility has shown that I'm doing with Bell Sawhill and another colleague, Julia Isaacs, that the American economy is great at producing more and more people earning above about $75,000. Now, that's above what I think most people would think of as middle class. But we probably have had about a 70% increase since 1980 in the number, in constant dollars, the number of families earning over what in 2004 would be 75,000. So the economy's great for that. Where we're not very great is at the bottom and helping people move from the bottom into the middle class. That, of course, would be the precise group that would move into the middle class. And they are not doing well at all. Their wages are virtually stagnant. They actually declined quite substantially after 1970 or so, and then they came back up, but they finished a 30-year period, a little more than 30 years, essentially where they started out in constant dollars. So even if they work full-time, if on average at the 10th percentile, they have had no increase in income over a 3-decade period. So there is a huge issue. If we're really interested in mobility, how do we help people that are willing to work and do work move up? Now, the traditional American answer has been education. And we all love education. I think everybody, again, it's in many cases a bipartisan issue. So let's look at education, and we've done this recently. Bell and I are involved in publishing a journal, and we focused specifically on mobility issues in a journal issue that Bell edited. And there were 3 chapters in there on education, all written by renowned scholars, one on preschool, one on K-12, and one on universities. And they all came to the same conclusion. What our schools do at all levels is basically help the middle class stay middle class. They do not boost by very much the number of people going from low income to upper income. The best evidence for some success is probably with preschool, and for this reason, Bell and I have recommended high-quality preschool. The key here, we have some differences here about the importance of quality, but probably a candidate that really wants to focus on this issue should focus on preschool, as indeed many of the candidates are. I have not heard any candidates say anything negative about it. Some of the candidates, mostly Democratic candidates, actually have plans. Maybe there'll be some forthcoming plans from Republicans. But I would emphasize the plans they must focus on quality, because without quality it won't work. K-12, we probably have more going on in the country than we've ever had, certainly in my lifetime. We have all kinds of big experiments. The Department of Education has done a great job, kind of ironical in the Bush administration, which is supposed to make up numbers and hide numbers and so forth, that we have really a huge increase in the quality of education and research. But unfortunately, so far, what it showed us is that we're not making much progress. And we, compared to ourselves in the past or compared to other countries, in fact, other countries are moving ahead. And then at the university level, which is probably where the real payoff is, if we could get more low-income kids into universities, that would be a key to move them into the middle class. As in fact, low-income kids who go to universities do go into the middle class. So, but unfortunately, we have not been very successful at doing that. This chapter I was referring to shows very clearly that family background is one of the great predictors, not only of entering college, but even given that you enter college, finishing college. In fact, if you compare the upper quartile with the bottom quartile in a longitudinal study of parental income, their kids, the kids from the upper quartile, are about 7 times as likely to get a 4-year college degree, thereby reinforcing class lines in America. So I think education is a big key at all 3 levels. We need to continue focusing on it and doing more of what we're doing now, and innovation would be great.
Thanks. I don't disagree with anything that Ron just said. I think what I'd emphasize in talking about the middle class is the example that you started with. We're talking about people who are on the minimum wage at one end, people who are on the alternative minimum tax on the other end. I'm not sure there is anyone who is both on the minimum wage and on the AMT, but
maybe they have a good marriage.
Or they're working 150 hours a week.
Yeah, right. But it extends beyond that too. There are people who are income high enough to be on the AMT who don't have health insurance. That becomes a major concern. There are people with relatively high incomes that live, as Bruce will undoubtedly talk about, in rural versus suburban versus urban areas. They face a very different set of issues. tax reform, it seems to me, is going to be a major policy that will affect the middle class coming up. Retirement security, there are a number of options that could make the system work better for the typical middle class household. And so it's very hard to define. We've come to understand that there's diversity among the low-income population, and in the last few years we've understood very well that there's diversity in the high-income population with, the people who are only making $100 million looking enviously at the people that are making $1 billion. The middle class is just about as diverse, and if you think of it as going from 15 to maybe in some cases 150,000, I don't know. I don't want to put firm numbers on it, but if you live in the suburbs of New York City or the suburbs of Washington, $50,000, $60,000 is not really what you call comfortable middle class income. And so it's a very diverse group. I don't know that a politician can, quote, target the middle class. I do think that whoever wins the middle class is likely to win the whole thing because it's such a big group. But let me toss that out there and for starters, and obviously we can talk more specifics if people want.
Bruce?
Yeah, I'll build directly from those comments because I think, we had some kind of focus group here with suburbanites, I suppose, in D.C. and Westchester. They probably would say, well, if my wages are sufficient to make ends meet, and then have a little bit to save and to put, sort of the rainy day funds away, then I suppose I'm in sort of a comfortable position. And I think for a growing portion of Americans, this gets back to what Ron was talking about, I think the central issue they face is that their wages are not keeping pace with rising prices. That obviously is uneven across the country because of the way different industry structure, given different development patterns. But for a growing number of Americans, what they're finding is their ability to deal with housing prices, even with the so-called market correction, and really to deal with transportation prices is becoming more and more difficult. And those two elements are really the biggest aspects of household budgets. So again, if we were going to have a group here of people, take your pick at the starting income going up to the top income, and you ask them, what do you spend the bulk of your income on? They would say, well, my mortgage or my rental payment, and transportation costs, whether it's the cost of owning and maintaining 2 or 3 cars, particularly in suburban areas, and dealing with the rising cost of gasoline. I have not heard a lot yet in the campaign, with the exception of the subprime issue, about either housing or transportation. I think we have heard some about health care, which is another, obviously, price and cost that people face. We've heard some about the immediate, threat of foreclosures and delinquencies and so forth coming from the subprime issue. And we've heard some about education and skills. But I've not really heard that much yet about what is really the 2 central costs that most middle-class families face in the United States, housing and transportation. These are areas of domestic policy that are not fully owned by the federal government. They really are shared responsibilities between the federal, state, local, and metropolitan governments. But I think they deserve, if we're going to have a serious conversation about this, not just about helping people in the middle class stay in the middle class, but more importantly, as Ron talked about, helping people sort of enter and stay. I think we need to put a broader swath of domestic policies on the table and have a really more sophisticated conversation about this shared partnership between different levels of government.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to stick with at least one of the themes that you've raised there, which was sort of keeping up. It strikes me when we talk about the middle class, there are 2 issues. One is sort of keeping pace with the costs of living.
Right.
2 is mobility, sort of moving, if you're in the middle class, upward. Everyone's desire to move upward in the middle class, or at least pass on to your children the opportunity to move upward through education. Or if you're in the lower parts of the middle class, to move solidly into it, or if you're lower class, to move into the middle class. But before going to that, I want to talk about sort of just keeping pace. and start with Ron. How much is work allowing most Americans to keep pace in the middle class? Is work viable, and if not, should the government be doing something about it?
I think the straightforward answer is work is not viable to keep you in the middle class. If you look at the last 3 decades, certainly at the bottom, I already mentioned it, the 10th percentile wages have basically been flat, went down, came back up, but for 30 years they've been flat. And in the, above that, at the 50th percentile, right in the middle, wages have crept up a little bit, and income in that group has increased, and it's increased for a striking reason, which is marriage. Because women have done so well, and women's employment and earnings have increased so greatly as compared with males. So people who are married, especially males, get a good deal, because that basically is the way families have moved up over the past 2 or 3 decades, is because people who are married do very well. Of course, unfortunately, if they get a divorce, then that really harms them quite a bit, and especially the women are at a dramatic disadvantage after divorce. We have lots of studies that show that. So marriage is a key here. Family composition is a big key, and families have kept pace or even moved ahead of pace by A, getting married, and B, having fewer kids. And both of those feed directly into the prosperity of the middle class, and that's a strategy that Americans have tended to follow. Now, the last thing that I want to say about this is creating families has been a real problem for low-income Americans, especially minority Americans. Marriage rates have declined, divorce rates are high, non-marital birth rates are huge and growing. I figure that something like 85% of black children spend at least part of their childhood, some of them their entire childhood, outside a married couple family, where they're at least 5 times as likely to live in poverty and suffer from all kinds of disadvantages. So family is actually one of the main markers of a difference between the middle class and low-income families, and we are not making progress for sure on having more of our families be married couple families and being able to share expenses and share income. And this is especially disadvantageous for males because women have done so much better than males in the last several decades.
Bill, how much has the tax code kept up with that, or held back those changing demographic realities of married households doing better, but individuals, as a result, falling behind?
Let me take a step back and just clarify something that I think Ron said, but I just want to be sure it's right. Basically, income, as opposed to earnings, income for middle-class households has been okay. Income growth for middle-class households has been okay over the last 20, 30 years, not great. But that's because women have come into the labor force and so boosted family income even as male earnings were stagnant. I don't think there's been an increase in marriage rates in the middle class. I think the income growth has come from the increased labor force participation. And what that means is that that's a channel that's been used up now. You can get further increases as you get closer to 100%, but women's labor force participation is looking more like men every year, yet the middle class is barely getting better over the last 20, 30 years. Having fewer kids is in the same category. It's like, yeah, you can make a given dollar go farther if you have fewer kids, but I think you want to think about whether that constitutes keeping up. It's sort of like you're treading water, and after an hour, you're still doing it, but you're exhausted. So does that mean you're keeping up, or does that mean you're about to go under? Maybe it means both. I don't know. But just in terms of interpreting what's going on, there's some of the obvious avenues through which income can be raised and expenses can be reduced have been exhausted, basically. And so if what happened the last 30 years in women's labor force participation, that increase can't happen again the next 30 years because there's just not enough room. In terms of tax policy, surprisingly, despite all the mega debates and religious jihads that are held over tax policy, the distribution of taxes in the middle of the income distribution, the burdens there really haven't changed that much. At the low end, there's been an increase in the earned income credit, which has helped working families. At the high end, of course, there's been a significant reduction in the last 7 years in rates, dividends and capital gains, estate taxes, et cetera. But the average tax rate, the average effective tax rate in the 20 to 80 range, I don't think has changed that much. It hasn't been a driving force in the middle class.
But I want to stick for 1 second with this idea of the alternative minimum tax, which we're likely to hear about a lot down the street in Congress over the next several weeks, and my guess is that will also reverberate in places like Iowa and New Hampshire. Is one of the reasons this has become an issue is that you suddenly have in middle to sort of the lower ends of upper middle class, 2 income sources in a household, and that's driving the total household income up to a place that used to be the regions of the super rich? Or is that an oversimplification?
That's pushing the 2 incomes is pushing people up the income scale, which is exposing them more to the AMT. At the same time, the AMT is not indexed for changes in inflation, so it's creeping down into the income distribution. So now you're at the point where if you have, a cop married to a nurse, your sort of standard, 2-earner, you'd think you'd want to call that a middle-class family, I think. They're going to be on the AMT, especially if they have kids.
Mm-hmm. So the tax cuts that started the Bush administration, as we wind into the last year of the Bush administration, are getting sort of negated by the AMT.
They are getting eaten away, right. In the 200 to 500,000 income range, about 70% of the tax cut is taken back by the AMT. What's happening is in the 100 to 200 and the 75 to 100 range, increasingly more of the original tax cuts being taken back. But that exacerbates the AMT issue. But the underlying issue with the AMT is the indexation issue. And even if there were no tax cuts, or even if tax cuts went away, 50 years from now, everyone would be on the AMT under current law.
Bruce, one thing that strikes me about these households with 2 working families is that increasingly in an increasingly suburbanized country, that's where a lot of this is found, and that's where also a lot of the swing votes are found as well. Talk about that a little bit. Do you see that happening in the country? Has that changed their outlook as both workers, taxpayers, and voters? What do you see out there?
Well, I think the larger issue is that place matters to a lot of this conversation, and and we tend to think of that particularly with lower income and disadvantaged families who, if you live in a neighborhood of high poverty, for example, in an inner city or an older suburb, obviously you're living in a place where the schools don't function, where there may not be that many jobs for your particularly for teenage kids to get that first entry into the workforce. You may live sort of on the wrong side of the regions where it's harder literally to get to work or find out about work because of fairly anemic networks. So we know with regard to lower income families that place matters dramatically, and that it really impedes and hinders the sort of entree and retention in the middle class. I think the way America is growing, and again, I think this really does need to be a topic ultimately at the national level. I think the way America is growing, which is almost uniformly across the country, though with some variation, sort of extensive decentralization of the economic growth and the population growth at the periphery of metropolitan areas, with some revival within central cities and some sort of revival within some of the older suburban communities. But if you look really across the United States generally, what we are seeing is the growth of essentially an exit ramp economy, where families like the typical family that Bill is talking about are sort of pushed out further and further away from the older and the mature suburbs to the periphery of the metropolitan areas where they can drive to qualify, where they can find that home at $150,000 or $200,000 that they can afford, which generally means that they have to drive back in fairly longer and longer commutes if they're working either within the public sector or in the private sector within the new employment clusters within the Tyson's Corner area or the Dulles Greenway or 270. this is putting enormous stress, not just on their monthly costs, right, but also on the quality of life in their family, because of the enormous amount of time, spent in the car, sort of not just getting to work, but carrying out all the other necessities of daily life. So, to go back to my initial point, we've always known that place matters with regard to low-income families, making the transition to the middle class. But I think increasingly, the way in which we develop our metropolitan areas also matters for families who would consider themselves to be middle class to basically move on up the ladder, because they are not really given the kinds of choices they need to live closer to work, to live closer to quality schools, to cut down on these crushing commutes, to lower their transportation costs, to really get wages and prices more in line. Now, again, the federal government, we're not England, and I do see some of our friends from England here. We're not a country where the national government is going to basically dictate development patterns, so that we can deal not just with these social issues, but also with economic and environmental issues. But the federal government has a dramatic influence on this because of their presence in the housing and the transportation sectors, and because of how they deal with energy and environmental policy. So, again, I'm bringing into the equation, I think, some sets of issues that normally are never discussed in this bandwidth, but really have to be if we're going to have a more robust and holistic approach to the issue.
Please jump in.
Let me just rescue my point. I'm glad Bill clarified. I certainly was not saying that middle-class families do not also have divorce rates and all the other family problems. But here's the point. They have them at a striking, spectacularly lower level. College-educated women do not have babies outside marriage. Their likelihood of divorce is much reduced. So a major part of the strategy of middle-class Americans for staying middle class and doing better is to form a family and to retain that family. And it works very well. Bell Sawhill and Adam Thomas have done analysis of Census Bureau data showing that if we had the marriage rate that we had in 1970, randomly matching individuals by race and education, we would reduce poverty by 30%. Now think of that. Just reflect on this for a minute. This does not mean we have any economic growth, no fancy new government policies, no redistribution of wealth. We just do what we did before. We paired off into families and raised our children. And that in itself would reduce poverty 30%. Plus, as a bonus, we have definitive research from great scholars all over the country showing that the kids would be better off. Not only would they have about a fifth of a chance of living in poverty, but they would be more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to go to college, more likely to graduate from college, less likely to have a baby outside marriage, more likely to work, less likely to be on welfare, on and on and on. So the candidates, I can see why there's some reluctance here because it's a zone of privacy here. But it is a major issue, and it's a major difference among Americans, including racial groups in America, and including immigrants who takes about one generation to catch on and start getting divorce rates and high non-marital birth rates. So this is a crucial issue for the future of the country and for our children, is to have more two-parent married couple families rearing their children.
I'm so tempted to ask more questions, but I know we only got a little bit more time for this conversation, and I want to make sure that members of the audience have an opportunity to ask questions if they'd like. So let me at this point turn to the audience and see if we've got any questions out there. Yes, sir. Please tell us who you are and stand up and use the microphones.
All right. My name's Howard Jones. I used to work for the World Bank, and so my interests are a little bit different. But one of the things that hasn't been mentioned at all is the tremendous growth in productivity, labor productivity in the last 8 years. And none of that has gone through to wages as far as I can see. And you haven't mentioned labor unions once in your discussion. Could you talk briefly about that and the impact of the elimination of labor unions basically in this country to wage costs, et cetera, and income distribution?
Sure. You're absolutely right on the facts. We've had robust productivity growth the last several years. It has not shown up in the middle of the income distribution. Normally, the average wage tracks the efficiency of the average worker very closely. And you're also right, there's been a decline in labor unionism, which has existed on paper. In my mind, it goes back to 1982, I think, when Ronald Reagan met with the air traffic controllers, and I think there was a change in the, aside from whatever statistical trends were going on, it seemed to me ever since then that there's been a difference in the sense of how powerful the labor unions were, even apart from the actual data. The other side of that coin is that one of the reasons we've had a lot of productivity growth the last few years is that we have a very flexible economy. People do move across industries. Talent, education, training does shift in response to shocks. And the decline of unionism has probably made those shifts easier because unions are not usually anxious to make changes like that. So there are both good and bad sides to that, and I think to that decline. And I think we're seeing in the data the fact that exactly what you said, the manufacturing, the productivity side of the economy is doing quite well, but the results are not being shared in the same way that they had been in the past.
And isn't part of the inequality also driven by the enormous gains at the upper reaches of the earning spectrum? Where I think what it was it in 1992, the top 1% earned something like 12% of the income, and now the top 1% earn something like 18% of the income.
Yeah, there are a lot of numbers like that floating around. That's either, there's two ways to interpret that. One is their productivity went up massively in the sense that deals that are 100 times as big as they used to be can now be made. That's sort of stretching it, though. I think a better way to say it is there's just something going on at the very top that's different from and on top of what's happening in the 90-10 range.
But the decline of union, it's also related to this restructuring, the loss of manufacturing. Manufacturing is only 10% of the American workforce today. And so as unions think about the next generation of their organizing strategy, it needs to be in the services sector, which is radically different. Now, a bunch of us were just in Vegas, which strikes me as one of the more unionized towns today, which, you don't think about Vegas as a place that is at the progressive end of domestic policy, but actually the way in which
I thought there were some quite radical things.
There were. We won't even go into that. But no, I mean, I do.
What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas.
No. Well, but actually, this part shouldn't stay in Vegas because I mean, the fact that the entertainment sector of our economy in that particular metropolis has struck a very different kind of compact between employer and employee is really quite intriguing. After the Katrina hit in New Orleans, and we were asked by the corporate civic leadership of New Orleans, which metropolis in the United States should we think about emulating with regard to some of our clusters of economic activity? And I said, well, since you're such a big tourism and entertainment metropolis, maybe you should think about Vegas. And of course, that took a while to sink in. Well, Tony, I mean, we're obviously we've got a ways to go, but at least on the wage and the income side, I mean, there's a good starting point.
Tony? And then Bill.
I want to ask Ron, if you think that families are so important, and I certainly agree with you, what public policy implications does that have?
I think there's several. One is obvious, and the Congress actually has tried to do something, that is to change the tax code so it's friendlier to marriage. And we've done a lot of that. Also, we've done it with the child credit to some extent. We could do more of that. There's recent research, especially for low-income families, that shows that the real penalties are not in the tax code. In fact, if you look at all families under 2% of poverty who cohabit, if they got married, they would actually do better under the tax code because, believe it or not, their EITC would go up. Where they would get hit is through the redistribution programs, food stamps, the temporary assistance for needy family programs, Sometimes they would lose housing benefits, or at least they'd be reduced, so they have to pay that 30%. There's a lot of work that could be done there to change those policies. And then third, of course, in a way it's unfortunate, but I think the Bush administration has done a great thing by emphasizing the importance of marriage and created something, or at least stimulated something of a marriage movement around the country. It has to be said right off the bat that it isn't clear that any of those programs will do any good. I know there are a lot of people out there saying that they will, but the evidence does not indicate they'll do any good. But we won't know until we try. And to the Bush administration's credit, they're doing big random assignment experiments, both with young couples who've had a baby who are not married, and with the young couples who had a baby. These are all mostly low-income families who are married, and in the former case to see if they can promote marriage or at least a better relationship between the parents, and in the latter case to sustain marriage rates. If those things work, and we learn something about a strategy for helping couples either marry or stay together, and they say, by the way, overwhelmingly they say they want to be married. Low-income, minority, all these low-income couples who have babies together say they want to be married will be far ahead, but it has to be admitted it isn't clear that those strategies will work yet, but we should keep trying.
I think we've got time. What I'd like to do is take two questions and let the panelists respond to both, because we've got about enough time for that. So Belle, and then this gentleman halfway back.
I want to put the issue of international competition on the table here. I think probably there's no area where the experts and the people seeking the presidency differ more, particularly on the Democratic side. You're going to hear a great deal of concern from the public that it is basically international competition, whether trade or immigration, that is causing wages to be stagnant or jobs not to be there. And most people who have studied this, economists in particular, don't find or don't think, it seems to me, that those have been important reasons for this stagnation of income that all of you have alluded to. So I'm looking for some comments from anyone on that. Do you agree that there's a difference of opinion here? And what should we be recommending that candidates focus on if it is an international competition? We found recently in the data we've just released, Julia Isaac's work, that 1 out of 3 Americans is downwardly mobile compared to where their parents were. Now, the question we get asked most frequently is that due to international competition, the outsourcing of jobs, and so forth?
My question is very related to hers and piggybacks off the discussion that was going on with him.
Tell us who you are, please.
My name is Tom Pallo. I'm with Progressive Democrats of America. We were talking about the productivity gains that have not been reflected in the middle class and lower class here, but have been reflected in the top 1%. How much of those productivity gains, however, have been reflected in the growth of the middle class and the labor class in the developing world post, fall of the Soviet Union and the opening up of these new labor markets?
Let's see. In terms of Belle's question, we would be idiots to close the door on globalization. It's like trying to stop the tides. It's going to be as successful, and it would be as trying to stop the tides, and it would then affect the effects of trying to stop globalization would be far worse. I mean, we can't beat the world by sticking our head in the sand. At the same time, globalization in general, the rise of India and China in particular, the shifts in communication and technology and all that are really big, transforming, radical changes. And just as it's, I think, wrong to try to stop that from happening, it's also wrong to say, whatever happens, happens, and, tough luck. It's actually a real opportunity for us to introduce policies that help people adapt to globalization, and rather than, which could make it more of a cooperative effort, than rather having the debate be, should we have globalization or not have globalization? We're having it, or it's happening. We can choose not to go along for the ride, but then we just shoot ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, I do think that what's happening in this campaign is a reaction not just to globalization, but to immigration, and a sort of a sense that the political class in the United States has really not been, on both sides of the aisle, have not been straight with the American public about what it will take to adapt to these dramatic phenomena. And I think what we need is a clear explication of those things, those assets that really will drive prosperity for the country going forward, and those kind of policy tools that will enable us to share prosperity in a more dramatic way over time. And so, from our perspective, coming from the sort of metros on up, where the corporate, civic, and political leadership feel like they're at the front lines of competitiveness and at the front lines of basically dealing with immigration, they are intensely focused on investments in innovation, because that's the only way this country will compete going forward, investments in human capital, education and skills, because that's how innovation will occur, and that's how we'll reduce the racial disparities on income and wealth, and investments in infrastructure, which we never really talk about in the United States, because that's the way we will not just move people and goods, but ultimately move ideas in a more effective and efficient way. And I think what's happening at the local and metro level is that we are constructing a way to adapt, and this is not uniform, obviously, because there are some nativistic responses to this and protectionist responses to this, but I think generally there is a more sensible mainstream response coming up from the bottom, which says, let's do what's necessary so that we can maintain our competitive edge, share prosperity going forward, which definitely has to involve some of the union and labor questions, and what we haven't talked about yet today is grow in sustainable ways, because this climate issue, I think, is dramatically going to affect our ability to prosper. So I think we're seeing the conversation happen like it usually happens in the United States when there's a federal vacuum, happening at lower levels, not just of government, but of governance, corporate, civic, and political, university, et cetera. And the question is, can we bubble up that energy and innovation and just common sense approach to things? And then we'd have, I think, a very different kind of conversation.
Well, the greatest thing about globalization is it's created a huge pool of profits in other countries, primarily China, so that our government could dip into that money and borrow it from the Chinese and sustain its unnecessary spending.
Well, I'll segue off that, actually, with a substantive point and then a transition to our next group. And the substantive point is the paper that I did for this project, which was about trade and the climate issue that Bruce mentioned. And I think one of the holdbacks in moving forward on trade is that in previous periods of global economic integration and trade rounds that went along with it, we could see the rising middle classes in other countries as consumers of our goods. And while that is undoubtedly happening in places like India and China, it's not being felt as much, so that you don't have big American companies on the exporting side really arguing for the next round. The biggest proponents had been farmers, but they're starting to see actually they're feeling comfortable in the subsidies they have. They don't see the prospect for lowering those subsidies in Europe, and they don't see enormous new consumers in places like India and China for their goods. So you've got a bit of a stall there. And on the climate side, people are now looking at India, China, not as developing countries, but as emerging markets, and wondering why they get an exemption that in the past had been given to what were thought of as poor countries, and now are our economic competitors. So you're going to start to see these two worlds, I think, collide with one another a bit. In the climate negotiations, you'll see American politicians start thinking about border taxes that adjust for the energy costs that we might bear by trying to act on climate change and trying to essentially impose those on developing countries that haven't taken a similar climate change goal in the world, where we might take a climate change goal perhaps in the next 2 or 3 years. And fingers crossed and all bets off on that. With that, I want to thank our terrific panel here. And we're going to just take one or 2 minutes to quick switch panels. I'd ask you please not to get up from your seats there, because I think we want to move to the next panel, which will be moderated by Rick Klein from ABC News.